I'd like to go into the idea of knowledge. I think for most people, the word knowledge really wouldn't mean very much to most people. I think the word knowledge is basically something that you talk about within education. So you have knowledge of a subject. You could have knowledge of nature, or knowledge of music, or knowledge of astronomy. But in everyday life, when I was growing up, and the people I live with, that wouldn't have meant anything to them if you said the word knowledge. It simply would have no value. So the assumption is that when I use the word knowledge, I assume that people know what I'm talking about. I'm not dismissing ordinary people who don't study anything in particular. And I think that there's general knowledge in terms of what everybody remembers, and you say in their memory they've stored the knowledge of their life, the knowledge of their experience. And I think in that ordinary sense people do process knowledge throughout their life. And that's what's called conditioning. So consciousness is conditioned by knowledge, which is really a description of experience in your life. So as you grow up as a child, you have all these different situations and conditions that condition your memory with information and knowledge. So you wouldn't refer to that kind of general knowledge as a system of knowledge. So if you study art history, and that's a system of knowledge. Or you study Buddhism, and that's a system of knowledge. So whatever the category of knowledge, general knowledge, or a system of knowledge, each person's memory is conditioned by that. And I think that's the case all through your life. Everybody, until they die, is really thinking about working out the meaning of their life, the value of their life, through knowledge, which you could say in a general sense is that all through your life you're learning to live, you're learning to adapt, you're learning to get along with the world. Whether it's in your own country, or you travel, or you read various books, etc. So I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong in each person accepting that fact, that consciousness is conditioned, and that we process knowledge and we learn about ourselves in the world in whatever way through that filter of knowledge. That in itself, in effect, has nothing to do with spirituality. I think spirituality is a very special case because from a metaphysical point of view, what spirituality is about is something that is quite different from consciousness. So if you take the physical body, then the physical body is basically an animal body, and it's subject to natural law. So we've got to eat food to survive. That's the basic natural law. And then in our consciousness, we're based on language, and then language is knowledge. So there are two different systems. There's the physical system and the psychic system. And then there's the spiritual system, as it were, which is not about the body and not about consciousness. So in effect, it's not about experience and it's not about knowledge. So also, by extension, it's really not about conditioning. So you might say, going back in history and prehistory, there are records in various traditions of people exploring this spiritual dimension, you might say. So it might be that in Aboriginal times, the consideration is that the shaman actually can access spiritual dimension. And it's true in the basic major religions of the world. People like Christ and Buddha, they also access the spiritual dimension. And in both cases, if you read the text, in Tibetan Buddhism it said that Buddha taught in symbols, and in the Gospels it said that Jesus taught in symbols, exactly the same. Symbols, you might say, are forms of thought and knowledge which contain many levels of meaning. So if you take, for example, a poem, you use ordinary words in such a way that you deepen the meaning of what you experience. So if you're walking by the river, you can just write in your diary that you walked by the river and you saw certain birds and certain trees. And you can just write prose, you can just write it down in a straightforward way. But if you were a poet, you might talk about the river and the trees and the birds in a poetic way, which is basically using metaphor and a kind of symbolism. Now, if you go to symbolism proper, then you're coming to the level of mythology. So if you read the Tibetan Book of the Dead or the Egyptian Book of the Dead, that would be mythology in a symbolic form. So a symbol, in a way, embodies or encapsulates many levels of meaning, like a poem. But it's not a poem, it's not written down in that way. It can be symbolized by a deity. So in the figure of a deity can be a lot of meanings within that. So if you take the scarab-headed god Khepera in Egyptian magic, Khepera can represent the creator god, the god of transformation, the god of death and rebirth. So you have a whole process of death, transformation and rebirth in that one figure, and that one figure would be a mythic symbol. in 1994, I had a vision, and I woke up in deep sleep, and all I was aware of was a sense of myself in a shower of golden light. So you can imagine a shower, like rain shower, and you're caught in a shower of golden light. That's what it felt like. And as that went away, I felt in my mind that I had the word bliss. So the feeling of being in that shower of gold was very blissful. And then I realized right in front of me there was a figure, a God image, with a golden mask. And the golden mask had the pattern of honeycomb. And the two eyes were big black oval eyes and a golden robe. And that figure gave me a red cube. So years later, when I was writing about my whole life, like a life review, beginning in 2003, I began to learn about symbols, mythology, etc. And I took all my experiences that were synchronistic, revelations, dreams and visions, and I put them in the context of mythology and symbols. And I eventually decoded the symbolic figure of my vision. So if we take the golden mask, universally that would represent the solar deity, the sun deity. So you find in the Gospels that Jesus transfigured himself in front of his disciples, and his face shone like the sun. If you read in Revelations, it says that Jesus' face shone like the sun. And when Moses went to the crown of the mountain, his face shone like the sun when he was standing face to face with the Lord. When in the Egyptian magic, when Horus is reborn, so we're talking about Khepra, the creator god of death, transformation and rebirth, when Horus is accompanied by Khepra in the underworld, and when he's reborn in the east, he becomes the solar deity, and he stands on top of the pyramid, which would be like a mountain or a primeval mound, and he comes face to face with the sun god Ra, then we can assume his face shines like the sun. And then in Tibetan Buddhism, when the Buddha is enlightened, he's enlightened when the sun rises above the horizon. And therefore he wears a golden halo. So universally, that figure that appeared to me is a solar deity and represents illumination or enlightenment in symbolic form. So we're talking about a symbol. So when we read about Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree and then becoming enlightened when the sun rises in the morning, that's a symbol of his enlightenment. But the fact of enlightenment isn't a symbol. The experience or fact of his enlightenment is really when his mind, or they call the one mind, is actually set free from consciousness and the physical body. So when he left his body and his conditioned consciousness, which is based on knowledge, he went beyond his body and his psyche into transcendental wisdom, and he put on the body of wisdom. So that shows that knowledge or symbolism translates into wisdom. The two black oval eyes in the golden mask would either be the scarab god Khepera, or it would be the cobra goddess Isis, and in Tibetan Buddhism it would be Kundalini, the cobra goddess. And Isis in the Book of the Dead of Egypt is known as the Lady of the Flame. She's the scarlet serpent. And in Tibetan Buddhism, Kundalini is known as the flame of wisdom, and she's also a cobra or a serpent. So it's an identical system. And the red cube is the garnet crystal, or what they call the carbuncle, and that's the third eye. So between the two black eyes, there's the third eye, and that would represent the scarlet Isis or the scarlet Kundalini. So the being of light is Horus, the sun hero, the being of light, which is myself, standing in front of the god Ra or Khepera, etc., or a figure, the figure of Christ, or the figure of Buddha, or the figure of the Creator God. And Horus is the son of Isis and the son of Osiris. Now Osiris can be equated with Ra, the sun god, and in the pyramid, Osiris, the dead Osiris in the mummy chamber, he wears a golden mask. So that means, although he's dead, the golden mask symbolises through the scarab god Khepera that he will be reborn as the sun god. So there's something, you might say, in the body, in the dead king Osiris, there's something that will bring about the transformation and rebirth. So that's saying really that in consciousness there's something in consciousness which we're saying is a conditioned consciousness, conditioned by knowledge, and we're saying that knowledge is language and language is symbol. So there's something in the symbolic nature of consciousness, according to the sacred texts, and symbolized in my vision. There's something in that vision, because I'm conscious in the vision. There's something in the vision that symbolizes wisdom. So that means that myself in consciousness, my identity in consciousness, who's experiencing the vision, which is what you might call the ego-bound consciousness. So you're in consciousness, you're ego-bound, you're earth-bound by the body and consciousness, as you are in dreams and visions. And to go into the one mind, to be illuminated and liberated from a conditioned consciousness, you have to leave your identity behind and enter nirvana as your true self. So illumination is really the discrimination you have between your true self and your ego identity. But as long as you're in conditioned consciousness, you can't realize your true self. You can't make the distinction. I mean, in ordinary life, when you're growing up as a child, you naturally get conditioned by your environment, by your genetic inheritance, by your psychic inheritance. So you inherit a character from your parents, you inherit certain traits from people in your family tree. So you might inherit a talent for music, or an ability to maybe work in terms of craft, of making something, building something. Just like a bird will inherit the ability to build a nest. So whatever that is, however that bird inherits the ability to build a nest, must mean that that information, that image of building a nest, because each bird builds a different kind of nest, and they're very complicated, some of them. So they must have inherited that ability to build a nest. So I think that people inherit the ability to paint pictures and make music and build houses. So everything we really do when we grow up, and we form our society and we form our culture, I think all of that is inherited fundamentally. So all of that conditions the child, and you might say, as you grow up, you refine your language, you refine your knowledge, and some people become specialized in certain systems of knowledge. So at the age of 23, when I had my awakening or spiritual illumination, when I was able to discriminate between my true self and my ego identity at that time was a university student. And I was in university, I decided to leave university. So at that period, I had the identity of a student. That was my ego-bound consciousness, conditioned by knowledge. And then when I was illuminated, as it were, I could discriminate between my true self and my ego identity as a student. And once that happened, and I began to read the sacred text, I became very involved in a spiritual life. So I began to develop a system of knowledge within the spiritual context. So over years, I studied various religions, I studied various magical systems, I studied psychical research. So I studied many levels of knowledge. And when I did begin to have a life review and study my whole life in terms of conditioned knowledge, I systematized that knowledge and used Tibetan Buddhism basically as a model, as well as Egyptian magic. So they're the two systems of knowledge that I developed. And in both of those, the key, you might say the key symbol or deity was what I experienced in my vision in 1994. So that means 10 years later I started to study, and within a few years I was able to understand and comprehend the deep significance of my vision. Now in 1920, in 19 68, at the age of 23, I was already illuminated in the sense that I could distinguish between self and ego. But that was on what I call an embodied level. That means I hadn't left my body and psyche like Buddha and gone into a transcendental level spiritual dimension. So that meant over the next 50 years of my life, I had to process my experience, which included synchronicities and visions and dreams and symbols and mythology, etc. And I had to do that in order to move towards a final liberation from my body and my psyche in a transcendental sense. So that means that, in effect, although there appears to be two levels of the one mind, in the embodied sense and the disembodied sense, in fact they're the one mind, they're the same mind. So the mind I experienced 50 years ago is the same mind I'm experiencing now. But that's still the embodied mind. I haven't left my body. I haven't gone into a transcendental dimension outside of this physical universe and outside of the psyche. So when I finished my study in 2014, it's been 4 years after my study, and I still haven't gone into a spiritual dimension, what they call transcendental wisdom. But I feel that the 50 years of processing my experience and my knowledge was what I had to do. I feel that I had no choice. I couldn't have done otherwise. I had to go through that process of knowledge. And I don't regret it. I actually enjoyed it. It was quite an adventure. So you might say each person throughout their life, from their birth to their death, will be processing knowledge. They'll be learning about knowledge, and that can be general knowledge, so that, for example, say my parents, they lived an ordinary life, they weren't educated, and they obviously were conditioned, they each had general knowledge about their life, and they probably didn't reflect on it very deeply, they probably didn't have a life review, and then they just died. And whereas I have general knowledge when I grew up, and then I developed a system of knowledge within the spiritual tradition, and now I finished that system of knowledge. And you might say, I'm still processing knowledge, but I'm not thinking about it, I'm not analysing, I'm not reading books, I'm not trying to work anything out. So for 4 years, in effect, I'm not really, you might say, my consciousness, although it's still processing experience and knowledge, it's not general knowledge, and it's not knowledge based on study. So I would say how I'm processing knowledge now is non-specific, so that I feel the way my consciousness works is more subtle than coarse. It's not consciously involved in knowledge, which is quite complicated and complex, is much more simple and subtle in that I'm not preoccupied by thinking. But I'm still conditioned, I still process knowledge, etc. And there's no guarantee that I will go into a transcendental dimension. But there's a chance that I will, but you can't predict this, because my first awakening at 23 was spontaneous, and I assumed that if I do go into a transcendental dimension, that will also be spontaneous. So there's no way I can actually prepare for it. I mean, animals, they're purely conditioned by habit. So the animals we see, they're born and they die within habit. They've evolved that way, and in their life they can only do certain things, and you wouldn't say within a life they're evolving, they're just carrying out the genetic code, as it were. Whereas you could say the opposite is true of a human being, because a human being has free choice, and although we are conditioned by habit, we can also recondition and change our conditions, and we can modify our habits, and we can create new processes, so that even though I feel our character is inherited and our abilities and capacities and talents are inherited, other things can happen within our life, like happened to me. I mean, I wasn't brought up in a religious house, yet at the age of 23, 24, I became very religious, or you might call spiritual. So that was unpredictable. I mean, the rest of my family didn't become like that, but I did. And I also developed poetry and art, which I think came from my family tree. So you might say human beings are really in a process of learning, because the conditioned consciousness is always in transformation, whereas I feel animals don't have a consciousness, they don't think, and therefore they're not in transformation, they're much more static, they're limited to their habits, and in each day they have to adapt, but they can only repeat what's in their conditioning. They can't actually change that. I mean, it's not impossible that an animal, to a certain degree, might learn something new, but it's quite rare. It's not typical. So that means if I, at the age of 23, with no religious conditioning, could spontaneously be illuminated, as it were, to distinguish between self and ego, that really means that that could happen to anybody. It's not based on knowledge, it's not based on what you know about religion or what you know about symbols. It's actually not based on that. However, after that happened, you might say, why did I go through 50 years of systematizing knowledge within metaphysics, symbols and mythology. Why did I have to go through that? Well, I don't have an answer for that. All I know is that seemed very real to me. It seemed like I had to do that. It didn't worry me, it didn't bother me. I just did it. So when I had a synchronicity, I would work out what the meaning was, what the symbol was. If I dreamed of a scarab or something like that, I would look up in ancient Egyptian magic and what did the scarab mean, and what was the context of the scarab within the Book of the Dead, etc. And I just studied one thing after the other as they appeared spontaneously. So I never belonged to a group, I never belonged to any religion or any belief system. It was just my ordinary life, and I had these extraordinary experiences, and I took an interest and I studied them, and then at a certain age I brought it all together in my 60s and worked it all out, basically worked the whole thing out. And it did work out, and I did actually complete my study. I mean, in the teachings of Krishnamurti, he would see what I did as erroneous, as totally unnecessary, and actually a form of self-deception. He sees that consciousness is conditioned by knowledge, and the ego, what he calls the self, is the center of that conditioned consciousness. And as long as the self-centered consciousness conditioned by knowledge is working in the human being, as long as it's active, then you can't be enlightened. And when you're enlightened, you have no self, which doesn't ring true with what I've studied and what I feel is the essential meaning of Buddhism, for example. And he's very much based on Buddhism. Although he doesn't acknowledge that, his language is quintessentially Buddhist. And that was his form of conditioning when he was a member of the Theosophical Society. So he definitely, in his teenage years and his 20s and 30s, he was totally conditioned by Tibetan Buddhism fundamentally. So that language conditioned the way he taught his own form of spiritual teaching. So when his teaching itself is knowledge, so any teaching in any sacred text, including Krishnamurti, who refutes any form of sacred text assigned to his work, nonetheless, that is a system of knowledge, that is a sacred text. So when people read Krishnamurti and follow Krishnamurti, they're following a spiritual teacher, a holy man who's written sacred texts. And in the sacred text, he's written a system of knowledge, and he's documented his experiences, so it's absolutely the same as any other sacred text. And in his teaching, he has a technique or a procedure where he analyzes consciousness, he analyzes how it works through the thought process, through memory, experience, seeing that as memory as the past, conditioning the present and the future, etc. So however you look at it, even if you, like Krishnamurti, actually deny the role of conditioning and knowledge and memory and consciousness and self and ego, even if you refute that, even if you say you have to eliminate that, those very statements, that is a technique, that is a system of knowledge. And then when you add to that his own experiences of enlightenment, the universal mind, cosmic consciousness, etc., his terminology, all of that is knowledge. So whatever way you look at it, that's as much a system of knowledge as the Egyptian Book of the Dead or the Tibetan Book of the Dead or the Gospels in the life of Jesus, etc. It's no different. Now, if you think of Krishnamurti in the universal mind, and he says the universal mind is not actually connected to the body, and he sees consciousness and psyche and dreams and visions as being a material process of thought in the brain. So it's very much a materialistic point of view. But I don't think there's any reason to think that thought is actually a brain process. I think thought is a psychic process, and like Carl Jung, I think it's in another dimension. I think it's quite different from the body. I think consciousness and psyche are quite different from the body. So when you go to sleep, you dream, so that means you go out of your body and you have a dream body or an astral body. And then when you go into the spiritual dimension, Buddha put on a body of wisdom. So each level of the three levels, they each have bodies. Now, Krishnamurti says that in the universal mind, he's not a personality, he's not a soul, he's not even a self. So he's eliminated the identity of Krishnamurti, and he assigns the self to the ego in consciousness, which is a material process. So you might say, if Krishnamurti is saying that he's in the universal mind, it's not connected to the body, and it's empty, it's pure emptiness, and it's a vast energy, it's a cosmic energy, as it were, then what is he in that universal mind? I mean, if he doesn't have a body, he doesn't have a self, then what is he? How can he talk it through his body? And he says, as he's talking to Professor Bohm, he's saying, that he's not a personality, he's not Krishnamurti, and yet he's using the vocal cords to speak through the body. So you might say, if you look at, if he's not Krishnamurti, he's not a self, he doesn't have a body, then how is he existing within that universal mind? So if that universal mind is like cosmic consciousness, so he uses the term emptiness and immensity. So we're talking about the idea that it's like if you walk into the sea, if you went into the sea and swimming deep into the sea, then that would be like Krishnamurti in the universal mind. But when you're swimming in the sea, you have a body. So if he's in the universal mind without a self, without a body, without a personality, without a consciousness, then what is he? Which seems impossible. It seems absolutely ridiculous. And yet why do people believe in him? When he's saying something which is just actually absurd and ridiculous. That to say you have no self and you have no body, I mean, it's absurd. So why do people want to believe in that reality? Why do they give him 10 minutes of their time? Well, I mean, I was interested in Krishnamurti from 1971 until he died in 1986. And then I more or less got involved with other things. And now in the last 6 months, I'm looking at Krishnamurti and reviewing my ideas of Krishnamurti via YouTube. And if I was illuminated and I could distinguish between self and ego at the age of 23, and I got involved with Krishnamurti at the age of 25, and I actually used to stay at the school in England, and I've actually met him and had experiences with him, as it were. I mean, why did I do that? When he's rejecting self, which is the essence of my own spiritual understanding, that self is the most valuable thing we have. Any human being, whether it's ordinary knowledge or specialized knowledge or illumination or not illumination, the most important thing in a child and in an adult is yourself, not your identity. Yes, you can be an artist, you can be a mother, father, policeman, politician, but you're also a self. And why didn't that discovery in myself, that the self is not the identity, why did I then take an interest in him, who actually rejected the idea of the self and totally depersonalized himself and everybody else in the school? He was more or less teaching in the school, and to everybody else, a totally depersonalized sense of oneself. And just saying that the self, the ego self, is fictitious. It's not even real. It's an illusion. It's a fantasy. That's what he said. I think the reason why I was interested in him, not in his language, not in his teaching, not in his words, but I was interested in what state of mind was he in. And I did actually experience certain states of mind when I was in contact with him. So I did get an insight into the various states of mind that he's in. But I still didn't come to a conclusion. I still felt that I hadn't understood Krishnamurti. And even now, when I listen to him talking on these dialogues, and my critique of him as I'm talking now in these videos, I'm still examining a human being, a person that claims they've entered this universal mind that's eternal. So he's saying he's reached the highest level, like the Buddha. He's saying that he's reached that highest level. And he uses the terminology of Tibetan Buddhism as well. And yet, in Tibetan Buddhism, Buddhahood is selfhood. Whereas his idea of Buddhahood, as it were, although he doesn't use the terminology, is actually non-self. There is no self. So again, there's something maybe fascinating about someone like him. There's something fascinating about where exactly is he? What state of mind is he in? How does that compare to my understanding of the mind, or the Buddhist idea of the mind? And my idea is that he's in an altered state of mind, not in the mind, the transcendental mind, but he's in an altered state of mind, so that when I've been in deep sleep, and I've woken up in deep sleep, of course you wake up and you don't have a sense of a body, you don't have a sense of an identity, you're just yourself in deep sleep. So I imagine that he's in this deep sleep, or some form of psychic state, and he really believes that he doesn't have a body, he really believes he doesn't have a self. But the whole reference to himself, as he's talking to Professor Boehm, he's using his language, he's using his knowledge, he talks about his past experiences, he talks about his personality, he talks about his life just like anyone else. He just seems absolutely normal. He's talking about his past life and his experiences and as a personality, and yet claiming he has no personality, claiming there is no Krishnamurti, which is absolutely hypocritical, and then saying he's in this universal mind, and he isn't a self, he's not in a body, and you think, well, how can that be? And I'm saying it has to be that he's in a deep sleep, which would be a form of altered state, because he's left, you're in deep sleep, you're not aware of your body, and so you're in this kind of interior space, and of course you can say you don't have a self or you don't have a body, but in fact, you would have a dream body or an astral body, and you would have a memory, you would have a personality, you would have an ego and identity, and that's precisely how it comes over, that Krishnamurti is Krishnamurti. He's not this kind of higher level entity or something in his universal mind, or some whatever, however he sees that. And also he says to Professor Boehm that there are beings behind what he's doing, that he's serving some purpose from a higher order of beings. So he's actually recognizing that there are beings behind him. And when he was out walking and he felt he was going to lose consciousness and went back to the house, the people looking after him said that that when he was out of his body, a voice spoke through his body and said that we're taking care of him. And all of his life, he said, he was protected. So if he was protected, somebody must have been protecting him. Some beings must have been protecting him. And also, when you speak, if you're out of your body in an altered state or a trance, then you're a medium. And the medium can speak through their vocal cords and yet not be awake in their body. And he's known to have psychic powers of healing and various things like that. And he said he can read people's minds and he can go from his body into another person's body. So he's got all these psychic powers, he's a medium. So I'd say if you look at Krishnamurti from all different aspects, then he's actually falsifying his reality. He's telling lies. For whatever reason, he's pretending that he's in such a different state than anybody else, because he thinks he's the only one on this planet, and even the only one in history who's ever been in this state. And I'm saying it's a false state, it's a fabricated state, and he's just a charlatan, basically. And probably most spiritual teachers are charlatans and simply people with psychic power, and they're mediums, and they can deceive people and deceive themselves. In one talk in California in the early 70s, and he would have been around 75, he was born in 1895, he was talking to a group of people, and they were talking about what happens when you're in deep sleep. Now, when you meditate, and he said that he did meditate in the very early days, before he entered the universal mind, he did practice some forms of meditation. Whereas he said he never did practice meditation, but he certainly did. It's on record that he did. But he's talking to these people about what happens in deep sleep. Now, when you meditate, you can go into different levels of meditation, and people that meditate have had their brain waves measured. So you can be in various levels of deep sleep or various levels of meditation. And what they say is that when you go into deep sleep, or you go into an altered state, or you leave your body's asleep, then they say what you are, they don't say yourself, what they say is you're the witness. So in that deep sleep or in that altered state, you're a witness, and you can watch your dreams. So you're not in your dreams, but you can watch your dreams like watching a film. You can see the dreams come and the dreams go. And you can just be in that witness state, in your mind, in your psyche, without any sense of anything. So you're not aware of a body, you're not aware of anything. But the fact is, when people talk about it, then how do they know they're in that state? How do they remember that they're in this state as a witness? How would they remember that if the memory and knowledge and experience weren't functioning? Because in order to talk about it, you have to see the witness as an experience. So that means it's still conditioned by consciousness, it's still conditioned by your personality, by your psyche, your ego, your identity, or yourself. So to remember that, like Krishnamurti in the universal mind, and saying it's the vastness, and that it's the source of creation and cosmic consciousness, etc. As he's telling David Bowie that, then he is using his personality, he is using his conditioned consciousness. He does have an ego center, he is self-centered. And I'm saying That's the epitome of egotism. That's the epitome of arrogance, to say that he's in this universal mind and everybody else in the world, everybody that talks to him, even Professor Boehm, he condescendingly says to Professor Boehm himself that he's not enlightened, nobody's enlightened but him. And that's the pure egotism of a narcissist. So why am I still thinking about him? Why am I critiquing him? Why is he, in a sense, so significant? And I think the reason why is because when you're in your consciousness, when you're ego bound, when I say you're ego bound, you have an identity as a spiritual person, just as you have an identity as an artist. So I can have the identity of an artist, a poet, or if I'm a friend of somebody, I have the identity of being a friend. So I have the identity as being a spiritual person. Now, as long as I'm using my consciousness, then you could say I'm ego bound. Now, whether I'm a narcissist or not, whether I'm deceiving myself or not, that's still what can happen in your consciousness. You can still doubt what you know. You can doubt your conclusions. You can doubt the knowledge you have. So as long as you're in your consciousness, you can question what you know. So you can never come to a conclusion. I can never come to a conclusion about Krishnamurti. I can never come to a conclusion about Buddha, because I haven't been in the transcendental level. So I can always doubt that in my consciousness, because it's based on question and answer. So knowledge is never perfect. So naturally, he's a mirror to my own understanding of myself or my ego, and I'm trying to fathom out what makes him tick, what's he all about. And so, again, because I haven't experienced the one mind transcendentally, and he says he has, then I feel he's the mirror of my own investigation, my own self-inquiry. And I'm saying that he's deceiving himself, that he's actually egotistic, and he patronizes and condescends to everybody he talks to. The children at the school, the teachers at the school. I mean, it's on record in all of the biographies of Krishnamurti that he never took responsibility for his behaviour. I mean, he upset lots of people, he betrayed people in so many ways, and he thought that because he felt he wasn't conditioned by his consciousness, he wasn't a personality, he didn't have any responsibility for his behaviour, because he was in the universal mind and he was innocent from a child, and everybody believed him, therefore nobody challenged him. And he got away with it till he died. But everybody doted over him. So I would say that wherever you go, in your body, in your psyche, and in the spiritual dimension, which is the reality we know, the reality in books, the reality of experience, you will always have a sense of self. So even if you can't discriminate between self and ego, Everybody has self. Everybody at some level is aware of the self as being distinct from the persona, the image you wear in society as a mother, father, son, brother, sister, all of that. So you're yourself sitting in the kitchen, you're yourself driving a car, you're yourself in a dream, you're yourself in a vision. Krishnamurti's need to think he's so different from everybody else, that he's absolutely unique. And he often refers to himself as a kind of freak, a freak of nature. He really believes that he's extra special. He believes in what the Theosophists said, that he's the incarnation of the Maitreya Buddha. And that kind of narcissism is a kind of psychopathology. So it's actually an abnormal, pathological way to see yourself. It's very schizophrenic, split mind, delusions of grandeur, what they call delusion of grandeur, and what they call ego ideal. The ego ideal is to have an idealization of yourself, which means self-importance. So I'm categorically stating in these videos, in my inquiry into the nature of Krishnamurti as a good example of a spiritual teacher, and there are quite a few people like him today as well, putting over that they're extra special and different from everybody else in this special mind that nobody else has. And I would say that fundamentally Krishnamurti is not deceiving himself, but he's deceiving other people and egotistically manipulating other people and being head of a very hierarchical elite group of people. That he's an elitist, living a very elitist lifestyle, loves the power of that lifestyle, the power over other people who worship him as the ultimate deity, the ultimate entity. And by worshipping him as the ultimate entity, they feel that they're special by being in his entourage, by being in his school, by being a follower of him. So they're identified with God, they're identified with Buddha, they're identified with Christ, as it were, the highest principle. And it's very tragic. I think he's a tragic figure, and I think everybody that identifies with him is identifying with a tragic figure. I mean, if somebody's abnormal, if somebody's deluded, delusions of grandeur, then they're tragic figures.